My name is Caleb Henson. I'm 42 years old now, and I live in Knoxville, Tennessee. I've got a steady job, a wife who sleeps beside me every night, and a life that looks normal enough from the outside. But I wasn't born here. I grew up in eastern Kentucky, deep in the Appalachian Mountains, in a place so small it barely had a name and didn't show up on most maps. If you wanted to explain where it was, you had to point to a stretch of green and say, "Back in there." It was the kind of place where your last name mattered more than your education, where people remembered what your granddaddy did, and where the woods weren't something you visited. They were something that pressed in on you from every direction. The tree lines started at the edge of your yard and just kept going, folding over hills and hollers like a living thing. As a kid, I thought that was normal. As an adult, I realize how much it shaped me, and how much it still hasn't let go. I've spent most of my life trying not to think about what happened when I was 19. I told myself it was stress, imagination, grief, anything but what it felt like. But the older I get, the less distance matters. Lately, I've been dreaming about that place again, about dirt under my fingernails and something breathing just out of sight. I've come to understand that silence hasn't protected me. If anything, it's made it worse. I was 19 the summer it started. I'd just graduated high school and was working nights at a sawmill about 30 minutes from home. My dad had died of a heart attack when I was 12, and my mom cleaned houses for cash, so college wasn't an option right away. The plan was simple: work, save money, leave. Everyone I knew either got stuck or got out, and I was desperate not to be the kind of man who never left the mountain. Most nights I'd get off around midnight and drive home along a narrow gravel road that cut through miles of woods. No streetlights, no houses, just old barbed wire fences swallowed by vines, rusted farm equipment half buried in leaves, and the occasional deer frozen in your headlights. People called it the Dead Road. Officially, it had another name, but nobody used it. The Dead Road ran right past an abandoned family cemetery that hadn't been used since the 1930s, back when folks buried their own dead because it was easier than hauling them down the mountain. That cemetery had always bothered me. The headstones were crude, some nothing more than flat rocks with names scratched into them. Many had no dates at all. As kids, we dared each other to run through it, but no one ever stayed long. Even in daylight, the air felt heavier there, quieter in a way that made your ears ring. One night, just after midnight, I came around a bend and saw someone standing in the road. I slammed on the brakes, the truck skidding sideways on loose gravel. My heart jumped so hard I thought I might black out. The headlights caught him dead center. He was an old man, painfully thin, wearing dark overalls and no shirt, even though it was early fall and cold enough that you could see your breath. His skin was gray and drawn tight over his bones, like it didn't quite fit him anymore. He didn't flinch, didn't raise his hands, didn't even blink. I rolled my window down just a crack and asked if he needed help. My voice sounded weak, like it didn't belong to me. That's when I noticed his eyes. They were cloudy and pale, like cataracts had completely taken over. Blind eyes. But I could feel him looking straight at me, focused and intent in a way that made my stomach turn. He smiled slowly and opened his mouth. "Caleb Henson," he said. Not son, not boy. My full name, first and last. I felt cold wash over me, like someone had poured ice water down my spine. I'd never seen this man before, I was sure of it. He took a step toward the truck and the smell hit me. Wet earth, rot, something sour and ancient, like a cellar that hadn't been opened in decades. He told me I didn't belong there anymore, that the mountain didn't like people leaving, that it remembered who was born on it, and it collected what it was owed. Then he smiled wider, and I saw there were no teeth, just blackened gums and a mouth that looked wrong somehow, stretched too far. I didn't answer. I threw the truck into reverse and floored it, spinning around and tearing back down the road without looking back. I didn't slow down until I hit pavement miles away, my hands shaking so badly I could barely keep the wheel straight. I told myself it was exhaustion, stress. Appalachia is full of strange folks, I thought. Hermits, drunks, people who live off the grid. That explanation almost worked. Almost. The next morning, my mom asked why I'd been out near the cemetery so late. I hadn't told her where I'd been. Over the next few weeks, things started happening that I couldn't explain away so easily. I'd hear slow, deliberate footsteps outside my bedroom window late at night, crunching leaves, pacing back and forth. When I'd look, there'd be nothing there, but the feeling wouldn't leave. I'd find handprints in the dust on my truck's hood and windshield too, long with fingers that bent in places fingers shouldn't. Every time I drove the dead road, I felt watched. Once I caught movement just inside the tree line, someone tall and thin, keeping pace with my truck, never stepping into the light, moving smoothly over ground that should have been impossible to run through. The dreams were the worst. Night after night, I dreamed I was buried upright in the cemetery, dirt packed tight around my body, roots pushing through my chest and throat. I could hear voices whispering that I was coming home, that I'd been gone long enough. I'd wake up choking, tasting soil, my sheets damp with sweat. Finally, I asked my mom about the cemetery. She went quiet in a way I'd never seen before, sat down at the kitchen table and rubbed her hands together like she was cold. She told me my great-grandfather had been the caretaker back when families buried their own dead, that there were rules back then, things you didn't disturb, paths you didn't walk, promises made to the land so it would leave you alone. She begged me not to leave yet. 2 nights before I was supposed to move away, I drove the dead road one last time. I don't know why, I just felt pulled, like something unfinished was waiting for me. The old man was there again, standing at the edge of the cemetery. This time he wasn't alone. Shapes stood between the graves, half-formed like people made of shadow, bark, and roots. Some were tall, some bent wrong, some barely human at all. The air smelled like turned soil and decay. The old man told me it was my choice. Stay, and the mountain would keep me the way it kept everyone else. Leave, and it would follow me, patient and slow. I got back in my truck and drove away, crying harder than I ever have in my life. I left the mountains the next morning and never went back. But sometimes, late at night in my Knoxville apartment, I smell damp earth. Sometimes I wake up and feel the floor vibrate softly beneath me, like something breathing deep underground. And sometimes, when I close my eyes, I see a mouth without teeth smiling in the dark, waiting for me to finally come home. My name is Rachel McBride. I'm 36 years old now, and I live in Raleigh, North Carolina, where the streets are lit and the roads have names you can look up. But I grew up in western North Carolina, near the border, where the Smoky Mountains roll into tighter, meaner hills that don't open up so much as they close around you. I was 24 when this happened, fresh out of college, full of theories and training manuals, and absolutely convinced I was smarter than the place I came from. I thought Appalachia was just poverty dressed up as mysticism. I thought stories about the mountains were excuses people used to explain why they never left. I don't think that anymore. After graduating, I took a job as a social worker assigned to rural welfare checks. Most of my caseload was scattered across dirt roads and unmaintained forest routes that didn't always show up on GPS. The state classified them as hard-to-reach households. Locals called them places you don't go unless you have to. One family in particular became a regular stop. They lived high up a forest road that washed out every spring and was barely passable in summer. It took nearly an hour to reach their cabin from the nearest paved road. The family consisted of a grandmother, her adult son, and two grandchildren, a boy and a girl, both under 10. They had no electricity, no running water, and no phone. But on paper, everything was technically compliant. Every visit followed the same pattern. The grandmother would meet me on the porch, already waiting, like she knew exactly when I'd arrive. She was small, sharp-eyed, and always barefoot, even in cold weather. The son never spoke unless spoken to. He just stood behind her, too close, breathing softly through his nose. The children watched from a distance, never speaking, never playing. They just stared. I told myself they were shy. Rural kids often were. The first sign something was wrong came during my 5th visit. The children weren't there. I asked a grandmother where they were, expecting something normal, school, helping their father, visiting neighbors. Instead, she smiled and said, "They're helping the mountain today." That was her exact phrase. I asked her what she meant, laughing a little, trying to keep things light. She invited me inside and poured me a glass of sweet tea from a chipped mason jar. I took one sip before my stomach turned. It tasted metallic, like iron and rust, and something bitter underneath. I didn't finish it. After that, every visit felt heavier. The air around the cabin was always still, even when the trees swayed. I'd hear children laughing from behind the house or deeper in the woods. Light, playful sounds. But whenever I looked, there was no one there. The sun started standing closer during our conversations, close enough that I could feel his breath brush my neck. He stared at my throat, not my eyes. On the drive up, I began noticing carvings in the trees, rough symbols cut deep into the bark, circles with lines splitting them, hand shapes with 6 fingers. Sometimes the carvings were fresh, sap still running, even though no one should have been living that far up the road. I documented everything, wrote careful notes, took photos, but nothing I wrote sounded wrong enough to justify action. The afternoon I followed the laughter is the day my life split in two. I heard it coming from deeper in the woods than before, clearer, more urgent. Against my better judgment, I stepped off the path and followed the sound, telling myself I was just checking the property boundaries. The trees thinned into a clearing that felt wrong the moment I stepped into it. The ground dipped inward like something enormous had pressed down on it for years. The soil was packed hard and dark, bare of leaves, as if nothing could grow there. The two children stood barefoot in the dirt, holding hands, chanting something low and rhythmic in a language I didn't recognize. Around them stood other children, dozens of them, too many. Some wore clothes from the 1980s, some from the 1950s. A few looked like they belonged to a much earlier time altogether. None of them looked hungry. None of them looked alive in the way children should. They all turned toward me at once. Their eyes were too dark, too deep, like holes that went down farther than they should. I tried to step back, and that's when the grandmother appeared beside me, silently, like she'd always been there. She told me the mountain took children that weren't wanted elsewhere, kids forgotten by the world, kids who fell through cracks. She said the mountain fed on attention, on belief, on people like me who came looking. She told me the children didn't age once they belonged to it. I don't remember screaming. I don't remember running. I just remember being back in my car, keys shaking in my hand, the forest suddenly too quiet. I reported everything, every detail. The state sent investigators, law enforcement, surveyors. They went up that road 2 days later. The cabin was gone. No foundation, no debris, no evidence anyone had ever lived there. The trees were unmarked. The clearing wasn't found. Officially, the family never existed. I resigned a month later and left that part of the state. But sometimes when I drive through the mountains, especially near dusk, I see children standing just inside the tree line. They don't wave, they don't move. They just smile. And they smile like they know me. My name is Thomas Reed. I'm 58 years old now. I spent most of my adult life as a volunteer firefighter in southern West Virginia, in a stretch of pole country where the mountains are steep, the roads are narrow, and help is usually too far away to matter. I've seen bad things over the years. Burned homes, burned bodies. I learned early how fire changes people and how it erases what they used to be. But nothing I've ever seen compares to what happened when I was 31. The call came in just after sunset, right as the light was draining out of the haulers. Dispatch said there was a structure fire on an old ridge road that hadn't been used in years. According to county records, no one was supposed to be living up there anymore. The last families had moved out decades earlier after the mines closed. Still, someone had called it in. We took 2 trucks up the mountain, sirens echoing off the rock faces, the sound bouncing back wrong, like it didn't want to leave the ridge. The road narrowed into a series of switchbacks barely wide enough for the engines. Trees leaned in close, their branches scraping metal the whole way up. By the time we saw the fire, it was already fully involved. The farmhouse sat crooked at the top of the ridge, flames rolling out of the windows and roof like it was breathing. The heat hit us before we even got out of the trucks. It wasn't the sharp, dry heat of a normal structure fire. It felt heavy, wet, like opening an oven full of steam. Then we heard the singing. Not screaming, not coughing, singing. It drifted out through the fire, low and steady, carried on the heat. It sounded like a hymn, slow and deliberate, but the words didn't line up with anything I recognized. I grew up in church. I knew all the old songs. This wasn't one of them. The melody bent in places it shouldn't have, like it was being pulled out of shape. We pulled hose and tried to make entry through the front, but the heat was unreal. It pushed us back even in full gear. Through the flames, I could see shapes moving inside the house. Tall, thin, pacing back and forth like they weren't panicking at all, like they were waiting. One of the guys grabbed my arm hard enough to hurt and told me to look at the trees. Every tree around the house was burned black, scorched from the base up, except for the handprints. They were everywhere, pale shapes pressed into the bark, some high up, some low, some twisted at angles that didn't make sense. They weren't burned, they were clean, like the fire had avoided them, like something had crawled out of the trees and left its mark behind. The singing stopped all at once. Not fading, not breaking, just gone. A second later, the house collapsed inward. Not outward, like you'd expect, but straight down, folding into itself like it had been hollow the whole time. The flame surged once and then settled into a low, steady burn. We stayed on scene until morning. There were no bodies, no bones, no teeth, no ashes. Not even melted metal that suggested furniture or appliances. According to the records, the house shouldn't have existed in the first place, and after that night, it was like it never had. The official report listed it as an abandoned structure fire with no casualties. Unofficially, nobody talked about it. A few weeks later, I ran into an old-timer at a gas station near the ridge. He asked if I'd been part of the fire up there. When I said yes, he just nodded like he'd been expecting it. He told me that ridge had been used for meetings back in the early 1900s. Said some folks didn't pray to God up there. Said fire was how you closed the door when whatever they were dealing with got what it wanted. I quit firefighting a year later. I told people it was my back, stress, age catching up, but the truth is I couldn't stand the smell of smoke anymore. Even now, decades later, when I catch a whiff of it, burning leaves, a fireplace, a distant brush fire, I hear singing, low and patient. Sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night convinced they are pale handprints on my walls, pressed from the inside, reaching out of something that never fully burned away. And I know, deep down, that some doors don't stay closed forever.